Continuing our reading in Abraham Hannibal and the Battle for the Throne by Francis Summers Cox, Chapter 17, Death in the Palace. As the Tsar's horses and baggage wagons and sledges blundered through deep snow along the bumpy, potholed main road to St. Petersburg, messengers kept galloping toward them as best they could. "Your Majesty, we have a letter from Her Ladyship Catherine. It is important." Peter tore open the letter, glanced at it, and quickly shouted out to his followers, "We carry on at our fastest pace. My son Paul is very sick." The rest of the journey was a desperate, panicked battle against snowdrifts and blizzards, the long hours of darkness, the bitter cold, a miserable struggle to reach home before it was too late. At last they reached St. Petersburg and burst into the house. Peter leapt up the stairs, 3 at a time, to the children's nursery. Abraham wasn't at all sure whether he was supposed to follow, but he did anyway. As he peeked around the corner of the door, he saw the Tsar kneeling on the floor in front of Catherine, his head bowed, his hands on her knees. She was white-faced except for deep shadows under her eyes, and she sat rocking a flushed and restless baby Paul in her arms. Little Peter whimpered miserably in his cot, while the old nurse sponged his hot and aching head. Over and over again the Tsar was moaning, my sons, my sons, please God, not both my sons, please God, not both my sons." Baby Paul died that night. His father took him in his arms, the giant of a king, holding the little body tight, their 2 faces pressed together. He walked back and forth across the room, again and again, rocking the baby from side to side, until at last Catherine made him put him back in his cradle for the priest to pray over him. The hours ticked slowly by. The Tsar barely spoke, but sat at little Peter's side, or paced up and down the room, chewing his nails, his knuckles, his fingertips, as the boy whimpered and fidgeted unhappily, his little face sometimes hot and fiery pink, sometimes gray and clammy. 2 evenings after baby Paul had died, Abraham was curled up quietly on the floor in a corner of the nursery, watching and waiting. The Tsar was sitting by the cot, with Catherine next to him, holding little Peter in her arms. Suddenly, Catherine looked up from the little boy and quietly said, "He has gone." Peter gave a great moan and stumbled up from the bedside and across the nursery. Abraham saw him suddenly strike his head so hard against the wall that he went into the worst fit that he had ever seen him have, collapsing on the floor, moaning and shuddering and twitching. Catherine knelt next to the Tsar, but she could do nothing to calm him. She herself was weeping, sobbing, and shaking uncontrollably. At last, when Peter's fit had passed and he could walk again, he staggered to his room and shut himself up alone. Catherine went and tried the door. It was locked. She tapped on it. No answer. She tapped again. "My lord, can I get you something? Some food, something to drink? Can I help you in any way?" But there was no answer. Not that day nor the next. Russia was without its Tsar. At last, after 3 days, the Tsar's counselors and Catherine all gathered round his bedroom door, and the chief minister knocked and knocked again. Your Majesty, we beg you to come out. Russia needs you. Will you force us to break down the door?" At last there was the sound of the key turning in the door. Peter stood there pale, unshaven, red-eyed, swaying slightly as he gripped the doorpost. Abraham, peeping from the back of the crowd, saw him stare at the counselors blankly. "What do you want?" "I'm resting." "Your Majesty, Russia is lost without her leader. Everything is falling apart because of this sorrow of yours. The country's out of control. No one knows what to do without you to tell them." Peter stood silent for a moment, and then said quietly, "You're right, of course." He went over to Catherine and hugged her gently. "We've been grieving too long. There's no use complaining about God's will. And we have little Catherine. Let's remember that." That's the end of chapter 17.